Willkommen zurück. So, herzlich willkommen zurück, meine Damen und Herren, hier für den zweiten Block.
Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, to our second part of the Franco-German dialogue. We would like to discuss with you and with our guests the different approaches, common goals and cross-border projects that exist in terms of growth, climate protection, social compatibility and sovereignty between France and Germany. And for our audience online, if you have just now joined us, I am happy to have here Mr. Stefan Wenzel, Parliamentary State Secretary from the German Federal Ministry for Economic Affairs and Climate Action, who is our host today, and who will speak about climate action here today. We are also delighted to have with us today the Director General for Energy and Climate from the French Ministry for the Energetic Transition, Mr. Laurent Michel. Welcome, Laurent Michel. We would like to look at our common goals, at maybe some differences that we have, and I would like to start out with a question to you both, Mr. State Secretary and Mr. Michel. Do we need to go away from fossil fuels? Germany and France have slightly different scenarios in this on this aspect. So let's compare them. Where are our main goals in Germany when quitting fossil fuels? Thank you very much. I'm very happy to be able to talk with you today about these topics during the Franco-German Energy Dialogue. And I'm also very glad that we have Laurent Michel here today in order to discuss these topics. We have decided, given the war in Ukraine, to meet in Versailles and to launch the Repower EU plan there. And the main sentence is that we want to accelerate the energy transition, we want to foster energy efficiency, and we want to foster energy sovereignty in Europe. So it's also a component from the industry in Europe. And of course, we have very different historical developments between France and Germany, but in Versailles, the heads of state and governments met and agreed on the common points, and we also had a trilateral dialogue in the European Parliament. This means for Germany that by 2030 we want to increase the share of renewables in Germany to 80%, and it decisive for energy mix, for electricity mix, is that we also use this in the area of electricity with electrical cars, which will allow us to save energy. Today, each car uses about 1 liter, even if most of them use 1.5, but it's less than 2. And in houses, we can also increase efficiency. So, and we are, of course, very, very interested in sharing our experiences with our neighbors in order to pursue a common approach as a union in Europe and to find regulatory framework which will allow us, because the European regulatory framework is the most important tool that will help us to do this. Thank you very much, Mr. Director General, to continue this. So the goal is 80% of renewables in Germany to be used for heating and so on. How can this be compared with the plans of your country? Good morning. Thank you very much for the opportunity to participate in this discussion and to speak to Mr. Wenzel. Of course, we need to share our experiences, and we need to accelerate our actions. So it's not enough to speak about energy efficiency and energy neutrality in housing and in the transport sector. We have certain ideas, we have certain suggestions for solutions, but it is absolutely necessary that we make sure that we are emission free. And we not only speak about electricity, we also speak about the decarbonization of heating systems and other sectors. And I think that certain processes will be changed in the future. In the transport sector, for instance, we will use lighter vehicles or use hydrogen, for instance. In France, this meant that we want to reduce our energy consumption by 2050 by 40% and our electricity consumption by 30%. And it is true we need to decarbonize our energy mix. We need to also focus on renewable heating systems, and this is also included into the Fit for 55 program. I think that within a couple of years, we will triple or quadruple our biomethane production. We think in France that it makes sense economically to focus on two areas. One is renewable energy, and on the other hand, it's the development of nuclear power, which will be based on the existing power plants and also on the construction of new plants. A few figures that would demonstrate this. We think that until 2050 we will need 100 gigawatt solar energy, which is also our goal for wind energy plants. We need to expand by 40% by 2050. And today we only dispose of 7 gigawatts. So this is a target that we share that we have in common with Germany. That means we have to promote renewable energies and also adapt our existing networks to these diversification measures. This is just to depict the challenges ahead of us. Thank you very much. Well, we have wind plants onshore and offshore, and we know that we need to accelerate this in order to accelerate the use of energy renewables. Are there any existing cooperation systems? Yes, in Dublin, we recently brought together northeast states, France, Sweden. The UK did not participate because of Brexit, and we came to the conclusion that we have plans to expand by 260 gigawatts along the North Sea coast. And I assume that UK would also participate with 50 to 60 gigawatts. And in Europe, the plan is to build 300 gigawatts offshore plants. These are, of course, very huge plans for Europe. So we have plans in Germany, in France. I think General Electric's works in Saint-Nazaire. We have offshore plants, and we're very, very interested to maintain these offshore structures and also to foster them. But we also need to build converter stations in Europe and not in Southeast Asia.
In letzter Zeit hatte sich nur eine europäische Werft, ich glaube aus Spanien, beworben. Auch das ist ein
And for other projects, we also need to include European states to make sure that the know-how that we have
auch in Europa zur Wertschöpfung.
also is used in Europe and that we use European know-how to do this.
Michel, wollen Sie ergänzen, was jetzt genau diese Zusammenarbeit auch im technologischen Bereich betrifft?
Mr. Michel, would you like to add anything to this cooperation? Yes, when speaking about offshore energies, so I could add 2 points. If you look at the map, we only have very limited access to the North Sea. In Germany, in Denmark, this percentage is much, much higher for geographical reasons. But when we speak about technical cooperations and an exchange of knowledge and views, of course, this gives us the opportunity to find out how important our instruments are and what we can use to expand wind energy. We can discuss environmental issues, fishery, not only economical questions, but also legal questions, warranties. We can speak about the connections needed or maybe permissions. In the past, we were able to learn a lot, especially from the Nordic countries. For instance, when it comes to licenses and for constructions, and we often find that thanks to this exchange, we can accelerate our projects. When it comes to industry and ecological development and sovereignty, then I can say that this crisis has demonstrated that it is necessary to strengthen our sovereignty and expand it, and that we need to develop technologies in Europe and create an industrial base. In terms of wind energy, of course, we have already accomplished a lot, and there are many companies like Siemens, for instance, that produce the turbines. And there are also French companies that are actively involved in these processes. The companies are already interlinked, but it is also important that we create these links at the European level. And that we give the companies the opportunity to cooperate. And then we come to the conclusion very often that we have very similar strategies. And we have to come together and jointly think about how we position ourselves towards the US, for instance, when it comes to tenders. And Germany is a very important partner for us in this context, that we represent and that we pursue a European vision. So this is important. And maybe we could speak about this a little bit when it comes to hydrogen or batteries. And we should make sure that we not only do research in Europe, but also are able to implement our findings. When it comes to floating terminals, we should also guarantee that European companies are able to implement and use their know-how. Now, when we speak about hydrogen, there are, of course, efforts of the federal government to develop a hydrogen economy. But this all is developing rather slowly. So when I hear our colleague, there is a certain will and a certain readiness to work on this. Can we use this current situation to accelerate these developments? Yes, I would like to thank Mr. Michel for having mentioned this. I think that this horrible war started by Russia in end of February also made the European Union and forced the European Union to discuss these questions more intensively, because this is necessary for our independence and our sovereignty in the energy field. But I'm sure that our common points are stronger than our differences, and I think when speaking about hydrogen, we became very inventive, because gas all of a sudden became much more expensive. The gas price will, of course, not stay at the current level over the next 10 to 20 years, but I also don't think that it will be as low as it used to be. Many investors saw in the summer that hydrogen derivatives like green ammonia, for instance, were a new business opportunity, and we saw this also at the COP conference in Sharm el-Sheikh, that there was huge interest for this, that European producers looked exactly at the analysis presented there, at the practical experience presented there, and we haven't yet seen any concrete financial investment decisions. However, the industry is quite interested in these new developments, and therefore I think we will speak about certificates in Europe, about new regulations for hydrogen, for the use of hydrogen, in order to use it in those industrial areas where we cannot use other options. Yes, you've just mentioned the US Inflation Act. Of course, this exercises huge pressure on Europe. What are your expectations? How fast can Europe react and create the necessary frameworks for that? Well, this is a very complicated question. There's no easy answer to this when we speak about hydrogen. When you read the newspapers, or if you hear governments expressing their points of view, then we see that the US is creating a very favorable environment for this. However, in Europe, this makes our projects much slower, and sometimes it even prevents them from realizing. So these developments in the US demonstrate very well that we need to act faster, that we have also to act fast, and we can do this. And for this, we need appropriate framework conditions. When we speak about licenses, we must not neglect the impact on the environment. Of course, we need to act fast, but we also must not make any mistakes, especially when it comes to the impact on the environment. So this transition from the prototypes to the commercialization of new mechanisms shows us that we all must unite our forces and work on one common goal. At the same time, we observe that maybe we have to act faster at national level and maybe need to support our companies so that they don't get the impression that companies from abroad are receive preferential treatments. They need to be able to rely on stable support and good framework conditions. So in other words, we have to treat companies fairly and also promote the stability of our networks and maybe look ahead and also see what the demand of the future is. This is also a task for the national regulatory bodies. So we need also to use good examples to find a common European regulatory framework. Of course, many questions need to be answered. For instance, what really is necessary in order to regulate the transport of hydrogen, for instance, or what kind of exploration methods are acceptable. All this needs to be discussed in detail. Thank you very much. I think there is another area that needs state support and funding. There are consumers, companies, and private houses. Then in Germany, we now have this gas price cap. Mr. State Secretary, could you please explain how the federal government envisages this type of support? What do you intend on doing so that we can compare this to the French approach to support our consumers?
Thank you so much for your question. Now, if you take a look at the German gas market, then what we're seeing is that we have older legacy supply contracts of gas from Russia. There was about 50% of our supply, and that ran via just very few companies. Gazprom Germany was one of those. Uniper is another one of those companies, and maybe 2 or 3 others. And in May of this year, we were facing the situation that Gazprom Germania was supposed to switch its headquarters to St. Petersburg over the weekend. And the German government actually put a stop to that. If that hadn't happened, hundreds of municipal gas providers would have actually lost their contracts, the legacy contracts with these companies, and that would have been detrimental, of course, to the overall situation. And it was a drastic step to stop that transfer from happening, but it had an important background. And we also put together a group of experts that was assessing the situation. The German Parliament was involved as an observer, and they tried to find out ways that could avoid private households, private individuals or companies to go bankrupt because of these price increases, and then made suggestions on how we could somewhat ease that challenge. And we said that we could put a cap on 70 to 80% of the gas usage or gas demand, and then have everything else beyond that be paid in full. And that might be an incentive to reduce gas or energy use overall by up to 30%. And we've seen that actually happen to a certain extent. If we look at the markets, the market players are reacting to that ahead of time before these savings actually happen. And we're also aware of some criticism to these efforts from European partners. Some were worried that we'd take it a step too far, that this is an issue of state aid, and that is certainly something that we're trying to avoid. We want to continue talking to our European partners. We want them to understand what we're planning to do. And if they criticize us, we're open for that. We're assessing that and then also assessing our plans. So everything that has to do with potential state aid, that is something that we're assessing and that we're replying to as well, to the European Commission, for example. Well, thank you so much for that. And Mr. Michel, maybe you can react to that and tell us a bit about the situation in France. Yes, like many countries, we've decided in 2021, actually, before the war against Ukraine, we've seen an increase in gas prices. And to break it down for you and put it very succinctly, we've looked at small and medium-sized companies, private households, and if a company has just 2 employees, they still receive financial aid. So there are options there that we have. And starting in October 2021. We created a protective shield for these households to support them, and we've implemented certain measures then in February 2022 in order to limit the price increase. So these are measures that we're going to continue through the second half of 2022 into 2023. And as Mr. Wenzel already mentioned, we would like to demonstrate and to convey this message to people that it is still necessary to use less energy, to reduce consumption. So we think that these gas prices are going to continue increasing potentially up to 15% maybe, and we will still need to support people from a government side. Now, this increase in prices will have a bigger impact for poorer private households that have a lower income. So that means that for them, they have to pay a bigger share of their income, and that means that we will provide additional support to these lower income households in order to make up for these price increases that they have to bear. That, I think, is an important message that we're conveying, especially to lower income households, because they are already doing a lot in order to save energy. And at some point there is no more wiggle room to save more energy. And the European Commission has proposed certain support measures. And what we can say is that, as of today, there is a supporting set of measures that will help people affected by these developments. And we see that companies also need a certain level of support. They're affected by this. They're private households, consumers that already did depend on this. A lot of sectors such as agriculture or forestry that are affected by higher energy prices. And we have additional European measures that we're currently working on in order to support small and medium-sized companies. So when we look at energy prices, we want to find ways to lower prices and to support companies that have to pay these prices. It is vital that we make sure that companies do not go bankrupt, because that would be to the benefit of European economies and European businesses if we supported them. furthermore, we are supporting companies, we're supporting private households also in order to make sure that consumers are still able to really support the economy. And we want to earmark 226 billion euros in order to support people. And looking at other measures that we've taken, those are measures that we want to build on, that we want to expand on going forward. So we are looking at companies and encouraging them to reduce their energy use and save more energy wherever possible. So I think we have to take the right measures in order to, incentivize saving energy and to reduce our dependencies. So if we reduce dependencies by 10 to 15%, that also means that the coming year is going to be less of a challenge for us. Now, you mentioned consumers, high prices, and you mentioned that you also, by capping the price, you don't want to actually increase demand because it's cheaper. So really to incentivize that people save energy, and that this also helps us, achieve our climate goals, to really get the point across that people should not stop saving energy. And Mr. Wenzel, how can we actually achieve all of that at the same time? And we actually gave people a rebate on their fuel bills for their cars at the gas station. And how can you make sure that this is not counterproductive? Well, I think it's important to choose the right tool in economics. There are examples where, for example, if you provide a rebate on your gas prices or prices for your car, if you have to make a stop at the gas station, then the issue can be that you provide this support and that does not actually end up with end consumers that have to refuel their car, but actually ends up with the fuel companies and the oil companies. And that is a bit of an issue in this case as well, where we've seen similar developments, and that is why it's so important to assess this properly. I mean, during the summer months, we saw the gas price. I mean, we had a range of 15 to 20 euros for legacy gas price contracts, and then suddenly we had up to 350 euros for or per kilowatt hour, so times 15 times multiples of that. And when we look at oil, that's a completely different story. The oil price actually decreased, so the wholesale price, commodity price for oil went down, but the consumer price actually followed the gas price development. And here you could expect that the margin, the profit margin for oil companies has actually gone up because they were able to sell that on the market. So this, I think, is a question when it comes to competitiveness, whether that's an issue or not. And in our commission, we've seen a discussion, the Price Commission had a discussion about these effects, that companies benefit from that unintentionally. So we still think that the gas price is probably going to be twice as high as it was before the crisis, before the war. And that still means that this is going to have an impact on individuals, on private households. They are going to have to pay a higher gas bill, but hopefully one that is not really going to affect their economic fundamentals and stop them making ends meet. And we also, of course, have to look at energy security and security of supply. Well, before we ask our audience here for questions, let's talk about the European market, European energy trade. Let's talk about, what direction this should be taking. Where does Europe, have some work to do, some further developments? what role do Germany and France play in this context? So what scenarios do you envision? What opportunities do you see when we talk about the European market and the cooperation of countries, ultimately also with the goal of achieving our climate targets? Well, the European electricity trade and energy trade plays an important role, extremely important role when it comes to security of supply, when it comes to decarbonizing the energy grid, meeting our climate targets. Which is why we've really tried to work on strengthening the connectors between our countries, because you have weather conditions, repair downtimes, and it's important to work with all of that across countries. And in Dublin, we discussed how we could actually build wind farms in a way that allows us to connect them to other wind parks. So in Bornholm, offshore in the North Sea, we have 1 gigawatts going to Denmark and 1 to 1.5 gigawatts going to Germany. So we want to make sure going forward that all these wind parks have connections to 2 countries or more, so that we have an interconnectedness there. Now, when I look at the North Link to Norway, that is something that has already proven a very successful idea. And historically speaking, we have about 9 megawatts here of water energy, of pump storage with Austria, with Switzerland as well. So that's something that has been built a long time ago for coal mining and coal production, for nuclear power plants. And that is something that we can work on, that we can expand with Switzerland, with other countries in the south, the MENA or MAGA region in the Mediterranean, Northern Africa. They've realized what potential they have in their countries. I mean, they can produce solar energy for 1 cent per megawatt hour. So this is a new opportunity here to create value. And if they at some point run out of oil, that might be a new product that they can sell. Now, you mentioned the MENA region, and they've been a player in terms of energy projects for quite a while. So would you say that this is going to receive yet another push, including them in these projects? Is that going to be a new dynamic? Well, there was a memorandum of understanding that I mentioned between Germany, Portugal, France and Spain with Morocco in order to see more production there, more renewables, importing that. There's an idea of also working with Egypt, Saudi Arabia, the UAE. They're thinking about cooperating more. So there are new ideas and new ways. And now, Mr. Michel, I would love to ask a question about the European energy market. Would like to hear from you what you think, the points of attack can be in order to really use the potential of that market. Yes, let me just briefly mention 2 things. We share an interest in a European market and of European interconnectedness. And this autumn, we actually incentivized a 2 gigawatt interconnector between France and Italy. And the French minister is going to travel to Italy in order to further promote having this interconnectedness. So these connection points are very important. Now, talking about energy markets, here what we'd like to see is that, the medium term, 1 to 2 years, that regulations are adapted so that the prices that end consumers pay are actually lower than they are today. And we'd love to see a decrease of energy prices. But what we cannot have and cannot do is that we have markets that are very volatile, markets that really fluctuate a lot. So this is certainly not an easy task to meet. And secondly, what I wanted to mention is that we have to invest in the energy transition. I mean, there's been support already, of course, when I think of contracts that support investment in renewable energies, and that is something that we will also introduce for nuclear power, and that is a great support for both businesses and private households, which means that they ultimately pay lower energy prices. These are, I think, important messages that we're sending. We see that the financing for all these stakeholders are important to be kept in mind as well. There are a lot of investment projects, large-scale investment projects, and they receive a lot of financial support. So we're very much interested in this debate that is going to continue next year as well, and we're closely cooperating with the European Commission in order to develop proposals. Of course, we're taking a close look at the energy market, and we are trying to optimize interconnectedness in order to help the market, and we think that all of that is possible to do. Well, thank you so much. And now I'd like to take a look at our audience here. Do we have any questions online as well, of course, if you like? And I think we have a question here in the second row. Thank you so much. And I'll ask the question in French. My name is Claire Tourieux,
Donc vous avez tous les deux évoqué le lien entre la souveraineté énergétique.
So both of you mentioned a connection between energy sovereignty and climate goals. That's something that I would like to come back to. Now, the United States are already doing a lot with their Inflation Reduction Act, but we still have a bit of an issue there with that new legislation. So that's what I'd like to ask about, and about energy sovereignty in general. That is one of the things that Robert Habeck and Bruno Le Maire mentioned in their meeting in Paris. Both touched upon the Inflation Reduction Act, and they talked about cooperating in order to counter that with a European proposal. And Mr. Wenzel, maybe you could answer a question on that topic. And I'm not sure if that's going to be a European proposal or development or a national proposal to have cooperation between technology companies. I'm not sure what Robert Habeck had in mind there. So what exactly do you think this is going to entail?
Staatssekretär, würde ich sagen, ja.
Ja, ganz herzlichen Dank.
Well, thank you so much for your question. I think energy sovereignty is something that we really have to develop further and to add to that. And this has a lot to do with our own capabilities. We've seen now what it means to be dependent on Russian gas and what consequences this might have. At the same time, when I think of the semiconductor industry and chips industry, we are very reliant on Taiwan for that. When we talk about rare earths, so we are very reliant on very few countries. When we talk about transformers, we are very reliant on a few actors. So we want to make sure that we strengthen these businesses in Europe, the position in Europe. But I think the only way to achieve that is by cooperating in Europe and by finding the right way forward. In Germany, we are still working on that. Mr. Habeck initiated a stakeholder dialogue for industrial production factors for energy transition, STIEPL, and they had a meeting back then. Last week, there was another meeting, and in December, we'll ideally have a couple of proposals from them. So that, I think, is another thing to really talk about, to have some common ground there between European member states. We have 72 IPCEI projects or projects of common European interest, projects that have a strong focus on innovation. So there we are, still assessing whether these IPCEI projects, this framework, support framework, is sufficient, or if we need more, if we need a platform for battery production, if we need to have something similar for energy transition. But ultimately, we shouldn't just look at the end product. We also have to look at supply chains, and we have to look at resources. Where do we source them from? How can we avoid being dependent on a few countries or stakeholders? And we would love to enter into more of a dialogue. Mr. Michel, of course, that's a question for you as well. Maybe you can, comment on this as well. Yes, let me just briefly comment on this. The challenges are challenges that we also perceive in France, and we've already, launched our plan for 2030. The president launched that plan, and it's not just about the energy transition. It's about decarbonizing a variety of sectors. It's about technologies, and it is about supporting companies and launching companies in a variety of sectors. When we think of batteries, electric vehicles, decarbonizing our industry by developing new processes, biofuels, for example, for the airplane industry, and we also include recycling in that. So all of that is going to be important to decarbonize our economy. And, of course, decarbonizing energy production using renewable energies, all of that is going to be important. So that means a lot of investment from the French government. And at the same time, we want to closely cooperate with our European partners. Maybe that is not going to be sufficient if we look at the United States with the Inflation Reduction Act. But we really do everything we can in order to move things forward, and we're taking these steps together. Now, I think there was another question here in the audience.
Ja, danke.
Thank you so much.
Für mich wäre die Schlüsselfrage.
Now, a key question I have is, when we look at energy transition, Franco-German cooperation, how do you coordinate expanding our energy grid and the electricity grid? What this seems to be like, for me, is that, when we talk about resilience, we've seen how important resilience is in our energy grid. And when I look at the measures that we've taken, I think, they have been national measures, political measures to support one kind of power plant or another, or leaving it to the private industry to just build what we need. And it seems like this might lead to two systems that are created that are not compatible and that don't create additional resilience. That means, if one company keeps building more than necessary in one area because they financially provides financial subsidies for that, and other countries don't. So if Germany expands renewables, that means that wholesale prices or commodity prices are going to be lower, which means for other countries it is going to be less interesting to, or less attractive to build more renewables in their countries. So how could you combine your renewable strategies? How can you coordinate, what is actually done by governments and what isn't? So my question ultimately is, we're still where we were 10 years ago. I mean, maybe we have developed an approach with our national strategies, but it still doesn't seem to be the case that we've made much progress in terms of cooperation between countries. So what would you say, how can you create more cooperation? Or do you just want to invest from a government side of things and leave the markets on the sidelines?
Herr Staatssekretär oder Herr Michel, wer fängt an?
Mr. State Secretary or Monsieur Michel, who would like to answer this
Kann
question?
anfangen.
Wahrscheinlich durch die Verzögerung. Machen Sie auf Deutsch weiter.
Weiß nicht. Ja.
I'm happy to start.
Ja, Sie beschreiben eine Herausforderung, die ohne Zweifel besteht.
Yes, you
Wir haben vor
describe an existing challenge. About 10 years ago, we spoke about capacity markets. We spoke about energy-only markets and everything that it entails. And now we're starting a stakeholder dialogue about electricity market designs. Some people say they would prefer an energy market design, not only an electricity market design. So very soon we'll have to deal with the question, how can we create this in an optimal manner, in a way that we create new plants. For instance, we have a new law that provides for it. And we need to coordinate and discuss these approaches with our European neighbors. ASA, for instance, has presented analyses for all the European electricity grids.
Die Frage angeht, braucht man eigentlich die Kupferplatte, die wir in Deutschland immer noch haben, oder macht man es besser wie die Norweger,
the copper plate that we still have in Germany, or do we proceed like the Norwegians do, for instance, who have regional price zones? Or do we move away from the price zones? So all of this will feed into this discussion. And I'm sure in a year's time we will have much more information than we do now. I would therefore try to gather as much information as possible in order to coordinate it at a European level, because we won't be able to achieve progress if everybody just proceeds on their own.
Michel?
Mr. Michel. Yes, indeed, this is not a new topic. But we also have to recognize that before the crisis, even before the crisis, there was already an increasing number of regulations and market information. So it's a very intricate system. Also, when we speak about the different industrial sectors, the different regulations on energy efficiency, for instance, on performance, on the performance of houses and buildings. So we cannot deny that we sometimes have quite technical regulations at national level. But even when we look at it as a total, it works quite well. And that was already the case before the crisis. We already spoke, we already said that more coordination is better and more cooperation is better when we speak about electrical vehicles, for instance. In our forum with the Benelux countries, with Switzerland and Austria, we also spoke about different initiatives for the security of supply in the event of a crisis, but we also discussed this in other formats when it comes to the cooperation in the area of wind energy, for instance. But we have seen that in times of crisis, we can not only have common problems, we also can work out common solutions for energy, to save energy, for instance, and to react in other crisis events. So at the moment, we disagree on the price cap, but we are still capable to coordinate our actions and not to work on our own. That we're totally capable of, and we have to look ahead a little bit and promote reforms. Of course, there are always other possibilities. We have spoken at length about the necessity to coordinate political measures, for instance. We have discussed in detail the subject of energy sovereignty. So there are many options to promote our cooperation. For instance, an independent supply with different commodities and materials. But I think this crisis has just demonstrated it very well. And before we had COVID, that already showed us that we can act fast at European level. Thank you very much. I would also like to read out a question from our online participants. And I would ask you to briefly reply to that. Somebody mentioned, you mentioned the Nordic countries and their approach. Are there any concrete measures and concrete examples you could mention here? Yes, of course, there is the law that we accepted in the summer in the Bundestag, which that concerns the offshore wind at sea law. And we will have a look at our experience with this. And then the second point I would like to mention is our meeting in Dublin, also with Mr. Michel, where we spoke about hybrid connections of offshore wind parks. This is to be the model for the future in order to promote the interconnection of this network, of this wind park grid. As to the wind energy, I would like to mention briefly that as early as 2018, we reformed a bunch of things, and we have introduced a general licensing procedure, a licensing package that allows to react faster. We tried to find a consensus when looking for appropriate zones to install these wind farms. And we have reduced the number of steps in order to reach conclusion, because we used to spend a lot of time during the decision-making process. So now we have a law to accelerate all these procedures, which has just been discussed, which just was discussed last week in the Assemblée Nationale. And to give you an example, how we can, that we are willing to accelerate these procedures. For example, we have found 4 sites for wind farms in France. Of course, this is a very dynamic process because everything needs to be discussed and decided in detail before process comes to fruition. And I would like to ask you to give a message to Germany and to France. I'm very happy about this exchange here, and I would be very happy if we could speak more about our common goals, our common approaches, and work on finding common solutions within the European context, which hopefully will come to fruition in March. Yes, I would like to join you in this message. We should just continue this exchange, and we should try and promote industrial innovation and learn from the best practices and implement these projects. Thank you very much to all of you. We would like now to have a little lunch break, and we will meet here again and continue at 2 p.m. and speak about energy transition in a context of current geopolitical challenges. We'll have many very interesting presentations, so enjoy your lunch break, and I wish you interesting discussions during the break, and we'll see you shortly.